Put your bare feet on the floor right now. Feel that cold. Now imagine that cold is stone, Roman stone. And it is January, and you are locked in a cell barely big enough to lie down in. That was the reality for thousands of gladiators across the Roman Empire. The men we think of as ancient celebrities, carved in marble and cheered by crowds of 50,000, spent most of their nights in rooms smaller than a modern bathroom closet. And the question nobody in the history books bothers to answer is simple. How did they not freeze to death? If you are using this to fall asleep, perfect. These mysteries have been waiting 2,000 years. They'll be here when you wake up, subscribe, and stick around. To understand how gladiators survived the cold, you first need to understand what a gladiator barracks actually looked like. Because the Hollywood version, with torchlit halls and dramatic corridors, gets almost everything wrong. The Romans called these training schools ludi. The word literally means games. But there was nothing playful about them. A ludus was part gymnasium, part prison, and part dormitory. And the sleeping arrangements reflected all three. In 2011, archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar discovered a complete gladiator school buried beneath a field in Carnuntum, Austria. What they found changed everything we thought we knew about how these fighters lived. The school was enormous, 30,000 square feet, a two-story complex arranged around a central courtyard with a practice arena in the middle. It had its own bathhouse, its own infirmary, its own cemetery just outside the walls. But the sleeping cells are what tell the real story. Wolfgang Neubauer, the archaeologist who led the discovery, described them in a single word uncomfortably. Each cell measured roughly 32 square feet. That is about 5 feet by 6 feet. Barely enough room to lie down in, and these weren't private suites. Some cells held 2 men. Neubauer said the rooms were barely big enough to hold a man and his dreams, much less a bunkmate. There were 40 of these cells in the Carnuntum complex alone. 40 tiny boxes where 80 men slept every night, packed along corridors like storage lockers. The Ludus Magnus in Rome, the empire's largest gladiator school, had roughly 130 cells. Think about that. 130 rooms, each smaller than a prison cell today, housing the most valuable athletes in the ancient world. Because that is the paradox at the center of this story. Gladiators were property. They were owned by businessmen called lanistae who bought them, trained them, and rented them out to fight at the games. A gladiator who died was a financial loss. A gladiator who got sick was a financial loss. And a gladiator who froze in his cell and couldn't train the next morning was a financial loss. So the owners had every incentive to keep their fighters alive and functional, not comfortable, not happy, functional. And the difference between those things tells you everything about what sleeping in a Roman barracks was actually like. Let's start with the most basic question. How cold did it actually get? We tend to think of Rome as Mediterranean and warm, and the city of Rome itself rarely dropped below freezing in winter. But the empire stretched from Scotland to Syria. Carnuntum, that Austrian gladiator school, sat on the Danube River. Winter temperatures there could plunge to -13 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not chilly, that is dangerous. And the gladiators stationed, they had no choice about their location. Even in milder climates, Roman winters were no joke. Ancient writers recorded the Tiber freezing over multiple times. In 398 BC, in 271 BC, Emperor Augustus, who ruled during what should have been relatively warm decades, reportedly wore 4 tunics layered over each other just to stay warm indoors. So how did the Romans deal with cold? For the wealthy, the answer was one of the most sophisticated heating systems the ancient world ever produced, the hypocaust. The word comes from the Greek hypo, meaning under, and kaustos, meaning burned. It was literally a system of burning something underneath the floor. A furnace built outside the building pushed hot air through an open space beneath a raised floor, supported by rows of small stone or brick pillars. The hot air would circulate beneath the floor, warming the stone above. In some buildings, hollow clay tiles built into the walls carried the heat upward, creating a thermal envelope that warmed the entire room from every direction. It was expensive. It was labor-intensive. Slaves had to feed the furnace constantly, adjusting the amount of wood to regulate temperature. They had to shovel out ashes to prevent the fire from suffocating, and the fuel costs were enormous, which meant hypocausts were reserved for the wealthy and for public buildings. Roman bathhouses used them extensively. Private villas of senators and merchants had them installed beneath their finest rooms. Military forts on the northern frontier had them to keep legionaries from freezing at their posts. But here is where it gets interesting for gladiators. The Carnuntum school had a hypocaust, not in the sleeping cells, not in the corridors where men spent their nights, in the training hall. The archaeological team detected a hollow space beneath the training room floor. A hypocaust system that heated the paving stones from below. This meant gladiators could train barefoot on warm stone, even when the temperature outside was well below freezing. Think about what this tells you. The owners invested in heating the space where gladiators worked, where they generated revenue, but not the space where they slept. The priorities were purely economic. The bathhouse at Carnuntum was also heated. It had thermal pools with hot and cold water, centrally heated through the same hypocaust technology. After a brutal day of training, gladiators could soak in heated water, letting their muscles recover in steam and warmth. But then they walked back to their cells, back to the cold stone, back to a room with no heating system at all. And this is where the mystery really begins, because the archaeological record tells us what gladiators didn't have. What it struggles to tell us is exactly what they did have. The answer, as best as we can reconstruct it, involved layers. Multiple strategies stacked together, none of them elegant, all of them just barely sufficient to prevent hypothermia through the longest nights. The first layer was the building itself. Roman construction was dense. Thick stone walls have a thermal property that modern architects call thermal mass. They absorb heat slowly during the day and release it slowly at night. A gladiator barracks with walls 2 feet thick wouldn't have been warm in winter, but it would have been warmer than outside. The stone absorbed whatever daytime heat the sun provided and radiated it back through the night. In a cell packed with two bodies generating their own heat, that thermal buffer might have kept temperatures above freezing even when it was well below outside. The second layer was bedding, and here we have to be honest about what we don't know. Organic materials like wool, straw, and linen almost never survive in the archaeological record. They decompose within decades, leaving no trace for excavators to find 2,000 years later, but we know from written sources what Romans of every class used for sleeping. The standard mattress for soldiers, slaves, and the lower classes was a calcita, a cloth sack stuffed with straw, hay, or dried reeds. A word literally comes from the Latin for sack or bag. Wealthier Romans filled their mattresses with wool or goose feathers. Gladiators would have gotten straw, but even a straw-stuffed sack creates insulation between your body and cold stone. It traps a thin layer of air that your body heat warms. It is the same principle behind every sleeping bag ever made. For blankets, the most common material across the Roman world was wool. Sheep were everywhere in the empire. Wool production was one of Rome's major industries. Even the poorest citizens typically had access to at least one wool blanket, and military supply records show that soldiers received standard-issue wool cloaks and blankets. Less wealthy Romans also used animal skins, sheepskin with the fleece still attached, bear furs in colder provinces. Ancient sources specifically mention that people used animal skins, especially in winter, as blankets. For gladiators on the northern frontier, sheepskin would have been the difference between uncomfortable and dangerous. The third layer was body heat, and this is something we tend to underestimate. A human body at rest generates roughly 80 watts of heat. In a cell 5 feet by 6 feet with a ceiling maybe 7 feet high, that is a tiny volume of air. 2 men generate 160 watts in that space, with no ventilation other than a narrow slit or a gap under the door. That body heat accumulates. It doesn't make the room warm, but combined with the thermal mass of stone walls and a straw mattress beneath you and a wool blanket on top, it keeps the temperature in a survivable range. There is another detail worth mentioning. The cells at Carnuntum and at the Ludus Magnus in Rome were arranged along corridors that formed a rectangular perimeter around the central courtyard. This meant the outer walls faced the elements, but the inner walls faced a partially sheltered space. The colonnades that ran between the cells and the courtyard created a buffer zone. They weren't heated, but they were roofed. Wind couldn't reach the cell doors directly. Rain and snow fell into the open courtyard, not against the sleeping quarters. It was rudimentary weather protection, but in a building designed without insulation, every architectural detail mattered. The upper story of these buildings would have been somewhat warmer than the ground floor. Heat rises. The Lannister's quarters and rooms for senior staff were typically upstairs. Whether any gladiators slept on upper floors is unclear, but the physics favor it. A second floor room above a corridor full of warm bodies would have benefited from rising heat in ways the ground floor cells never could. But here is the thing. Survivable is not the same as comfortable, and some gladiator schools went beyond the bare minimum. Not out of kindness, out of investment strategy. For most Romans who couldn't afford a hypocaust, the standard heating device was a brazier, a portable metal container, usually bronze or iron, round or rectangular, filled with hot charcoal. They had raised feet to protect the floor and handles to carry them from room to room. The Romans called these foculi. They were everywhere, found in homes, in shops, in public buildings, in military barracks across the empire. Archaeological excavations have recovered hundreds of them from sites throughout Roman Europe. Whether gladiator cells had individual braziers is debated. The fire risk in a stone building packed with straw mattresses would have been significant, but corridor braziers, placed at intervals along the hallways between cells, are very likely. They wouldn't have heated the cells directly, but they would have raised the ambient temperature of the entire wing. And then there was the food. This might seem like a strange thing to connect to staying warm, but the gladiator diet was specifically designed to generate internal heat. Gladiators were called hordearii, barley men. A study published in 2014 in the journal PLOS ONE, conducted by researchers from the University of Bern and the Medical University of Vienna, confirmed through isotopic analysis of gladiator bones from a cemetery in Ephesus, Turkey, that these fighters ate an overwhelmingly plant-based diet: barley, beans, dried fruit. Roughly 70 to 80% of their calories came from carbohydrates. This wasn't because their owners were health conscious. It was strategic. A high carbohydrate diet builds a layer of subcutaneous fat beneath the skin. That fat layer served two purposes. In the arena, it protected blood vessels and nerves from shallow cuts. A sword stroke that sliced through a layer of fat would bleed dramatically for the crowd without causing crippling damage. And in the barracks at night, that same fat layer was insulation. Researchers at the Austrian Archaeological Institute noted that gladiators were likely overweight by modern athletic standards, not the chiseled physiques of Hollywood, broader, heavier, with a protective layer of fat that Hollywood never shows you. That extra body mass generated more heat at rest. Combined with the high-calorie evening meal of barley porridge, called sagina, a gladiator's body would have been producing significant warmth through the digestive process alone during the first hours of sleep. The gladiators also drank something peculiar, a tonic made from plant ashes dissolved in water. For centuries, historians thought this was superstition, but the 2014 study confirmed that bone samples from gladiator remains showed significantly higher calcium and strontium levels than the general population. The ash drink was mineral supplementation. It strengthened bones to withstand the impacts of combat. But calcium also plays a role in muscle function and circulation. Better circulation means more efficient heat distribution throughout the body, especially to the extremities that go numb first in cold conditions. Now, let's talk about what happened on the coldest nights. The nights when walls and blankets and body fat weren't enough. Ancient Roman writers tell us something interesting about how ordinary people dealt with extreme cold. When all else failed, they simply went to sleep earlier. The logic was straightforward. You can't feel cold when you are unconscious. And in an era before electric lights, there wasn't much to do after dark anyway. Gladiators, whose daily schedule was rigidly controlled, likely followed a similar pattern. Training started at dawn. The day was physically brutal. By evening, exhaustion would have made falling asleep easier regardless of temperature. The tetrad system, a training cycle borrowed from Greek athletics, organized gladiator training into 4-day rotations. Day 1 was preparation with toning exercises. Day 2 was maximum intensity. Day 3 was skill work. Day 4 was rest. After a Day 2 session, a gladiator would have been so physically depleted that sleeping on cold stone might not have mattered. And then there were the baths. This is maybe the most important piece of the puzzle, and it is the one most people overlook. Roman bathhouses weren't just about hygiene. They were thermal charging stations. A gladiator who soaked in a heated pool in the late afternoon would carry that warmth in his body for hours. Muscles relaxed by hot water retain heat longer. Core body temperature elevated by immersion takes time to drop back to baseline. The Carnuntum bathhouse was centrally heated. Hot water, cold water, and warm transitional pools. The Romans had specific protocols for bathing. You moved from the tepidarium, the warm room, to the caldarium, the hot room, where temperatures could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit with nearly 100% humidity. After that thermal blast, a gladiator walking back to his cell would have carried significant residual warmth. If he went directly to bed, wrapping himself in wool on a straw mattress in a small stone cell, his body would have been radiating stored heat for perhaps the first 2 to 3 hours of sleep. By then, the deepest phase of sleep would have been underway. But here is the thing. Not every gladiator school was Carnuntum. Not every school had heated training halls and thermal baths. The Pompeii Barracks, for example, were a converted theatre foyer, a 4-sided colonnade with rooms along the wings that were never designed for year-round habitation. Pompeii's climate was milder than Austria's winter temperatures, rarely dropped below the mid-30s Fahrenheit. Uncomfortable, certainly. Dangerous for a man in a thin tunic on a stone floor, possibly. But the archaeological evidence from Pompeii tells a different story than Carnuntum. When archaeologists excavated the Pompeii gladiator barracks, they found something unexpected beneath the building, an ergastulum. A slave prison. 4 skeletons were discovered there, unchained despite the presence of iron fetters. Whatever warmth existed in the rooms above, the men below had even less. And this brings us to the darker question that sits underneath all of this. How many didn't survive? The archaeological record is silent on this point in a very specific way. Gladiator cemeteries exist. The one at Ephesus has yielded extensive skeletal analysis, but cause of death for most gladiator remains is listed as combat injuries. Nobody was recording deaths from exposure. Nobody was noting when a gladiator caught pneumonia from sleeping in freezing conditions and died of infection weeks later. The medical infrastructure in gladiator schools included infirmaries and even surgical instruments found at Pompeii. But the line between combat death and environmental death blurred constantly. There is a cemetery just outside the walls of the Carnuntum Gladiator School. The archaeologists detected it with ground-penetrating radar, but haven't excavated it yet. When they do, the bones may tell us things the written record never bothered to mention. Now, you might be wondering about the gladiators who were not at the bottom of the hierarchy. Because gladiator schools had rigid social structures, and not everyone slept the same way. At Carnuntum, the archaeologists identified rooms in the western wing that were significantly more spacious than the standard cells. Some appeared to have had tiled floors rather than bare stone. These were likely quarters for the highest-ranking gladiators, the Primus Palace veterans, who had survived dozens of fights and earned elevated status. The trainers, called doctors, who were often retired gladiators themselves, would have had even better accommodations. And the Lannister who owned the school typically lived on the upper floor, well above the cells, with access to whatever heating his wealth could provide. Emperor Commodus, who ruled from 180 to 192 AD, and was famously obsessed with gladiatorial combat, allegedly slept in one of the cells at the Ludus Magnus in Rome. The historian Herodian recorded this, but Commodus was an emperor choosing to play gladiator. He could leave whenever he wanted. The men in the cells around him could not. There is another factor we haven't discussed yet: clothing. During the day, gladiators trained in minimal clothing, short linen tunics or just loincloths. But at night, there is no reason to believe they didn't layer up the way every other Roman did in winter. Roman soldiers on the northern frontier wore multiple wool tunics layered over each other. They had short wool trousers called bracci. They had hooded cloaks. They had wool socks called udones. Letters between soldiers stationed in Britain and their families back in Rome show that clothing was regularly shipped to men in cold provinces. Gladiators were investments worth protecting. A Lannister who lost fighters to cold weather illness would have been losing money directly. Providing basic wool garments for nighttime wear would have been far cheaper than replacing a trained fighter. The cost of a few wool tunics versus the cost of purchasing and training a new gladiator for years. The math was obvious. We know from gladiator graffiti at Pompeii that fighters took pride in their records. They scratched their names and victories into the columns of the barracks. Thracians with curved swords, Myrmilones with fish-crested helmets, Riciari with their nets and tridents. These weren't anonymous prisoners. They were specialists who trained for years in specific fighting styles. That specialization meant that every gladiator who died from preventable causes, whether cold exposure, illness, or infection, represented years of lost training investment. The Lannister wasn't just losing a body. He was losing a product he had spent years developing. A Riciarius who could work a crowd, who knew how to make a fight last long enough to entertain, who knew when to press and when to retreat. You couldn't replace that overnight. And this is the part of the story that matters most, the part that archaeology can show us but history books often skip past. The gladiator sleeping experience wasn't just about temperature. It was about control. These men slept behind locked doors, in rooms with one exit, in a building with a single gate. Neubauer described the Carnuntum school as a fortress with only one way out. The cold was part of the control system, not intentional cruelty necessarily, but certainly not a priority to fix. A cold gladiator wakes up stiff, his muscles are tight, his joints ache. And what does the training schedule require? Morning exercises to warm up. The cold itself drove compliance with the system. Get up, get moving, get warm through the only means available to you. Work. There is a sunken cell at Carnuntum that the archaeologists identified near the main entrance. It had no access to daylight, a ceiling so low that standing was impossible. This was the brig. Punishment for unruly fighters. If the standard cells were barely tolerable in winter, this chamber would have been genuinely dangerous. And yet, gladiators survived. Most of them, most of the time. The typical gladiator fought only 2 or 3 times per year. The rest of the time was training, eating, recovering, and sleeping. The system, however miserable, functioned well enough to maintain a fighting force. Some gladiators served for years. They accumulated victories tracked in graffiti on barracks walls. At Pompeii, over 120 inscriptions were found recording fighters' names, win records, and fighting styles. These men survived hundreds of cold nights to carve their stories into the walls around them. If they earned enough victories, they might receive the rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing their release from the arena, freedom, and never having to sleep in one of those cells again. But here is what makes this story genuinely fascinating rather than just sad. The Romans who built these barracks also invented central heating. They knew how to warm buildings. They had the technology. They chose not to use it in gladiator sleeping quarters, at the same public bathhouses where gladiators warmed their bodies each afternoon. Ordinary Roman citizens enjoyed the same heated rooms. The caldarium could reach temperatures that would rival a modern sauna. The technology was proven, widespread, and available. The decision not to heat gladiator cells wasn't technological. It was economic and social. Hypocausts required constant fuel, constant labor to tend the furnace. The cost of heating 40 individual cells around the clock through a 4-month winter would have been enormous, and gladiators were property. You kept property functional. You didn't keep it comfortable. It is the same logic that explains why the training hall had heated floors, but the dormitory didn't. Training generated revenue, sleeping didn't. Every decision was filtered through that calculation, and there is something else worth considering. Something that sits at the intersection of archaeology, physiology, and the history of human endurance. Humans are remarkably adaptable to cold. Studies of populations in cold climates, from Inuit communities to Tierra del Fuego natives, show that the human body can acclimatize to sustained cold exposure. Peripheral blood vessels learn to cycle between constriction and dilation. Brown fat deposits increase. Shivering thresholds adjust downward. There is actually a fascinating comparison to be drawn with the Roman military. Legionary barracks on the northern frontier in Britain and Germany and along the Danube faced the same cold weather challenges. And the archaeological record shows that military barracks were heated more consistently than gladiator cells. Roman forts at Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall and at legionary bases along the Rhine had hypocausts installed in bathhouses and sometimes in the officers' quarters. Soldiers had standard issue wool blankets and cloaks. They had communal fires, and they had something gladiators generally didn't: freedom of movement within their barracks. A legionary could get up in the night, walk to a communal fire, warm himself, and return to bed. A gladiator locked in his cell could not. The constraint of the locked door transformed cold from an inconvenience into something closer to torment. Letters found at Vindolanda, the famous collection of writing tablets from Roman Britain, include requests from soldiers asking their families to send warm clothing, socks, underwear, extra tunics. These were men who had access to military supply chains and still needed supplemental warmth from home. Gladiators had no families to write to. Most were slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. Some were volunteers who had signed away their rights for the chance at glory and money. None of them were sending letters home asking for warm socks. Whatever warmth they had came from what the system provided. And the system provided exactly as much as was necessary to protect its investment. Not a degree more. There is one more thermal strategy that deserves mention, and it is so simple that it is easy to overlook. The Romans understood the concept of thermal mass, not just in their walls but in their floors. Some gladiator cells likely had packed earth floors rather than bare stone. Earth is a better insulator than stone. A straw mattress on packed earth would have lost less heat than the same mattress on stone. We can't confirm this for every barracks. Floor materials vary by site, by region, and by the wealth of the school's owner. But it is worth noting that the most expensive gladiator schools, the ones connected to the Colosseum in Rome, had stone and tile floors. The provincial schools, the ones scattered across the empire in smaller towns, may have used simpler materials that accidentally provided better insulation. A gladiator who spent his first winter in a carnuntum cell might have suffered terribly. But by his third or fourth winter, his body would have adapted, not to comfort, but to survival. The human organism, when given no other option, learns to endure what seemed impossible. And maybe that is the real answer to the question: how did gladiators sleep in Roman barracks without freezing? They did it the way humans have always survived impossible conditions, with layers of marginal solutions stacked together: thick walls, straw mattresses, wool blankets, shared body heat, residual warmth from baths, a diet that built insulation under the skin, and bodies that slowly, painfully, learned to tolerate what they couldn't change. None of it was enough by itself. All of it together was just barely enough, and on the worst nights, when the wind howled off the Danube and ice formed on the interior walls of their cells, some of them probably didn't sleep at all. They just endured until dawn. Think about that. the next time you pull a warm blanket up to your chin, somewhere in the 1st or 2nd century, a man lying on straw in a stone box smaller than your bed was doing the same thing, pulling rough wool tighter, curling inward, waiting for the sun. The Carnuntum Gladiator School is still buried beneath that Austrian field. Less than 1% of it has been excavated. The sleeping cells, the punishment chamber, the cemetery outside the walls, all of it remains underground, holding answers to questions we haven't thought to ask yet, and that is perhaps the most fitting metaphor for this entire story. The lives of gladiators, like their barracks, are mostly hidden. We see the arena, the combat, the spectacle. But the hours between fights, the long cold nights, the small desperate strategies for warmth, those stay buried. There is something worth sitting with here. We celebrate the gladiator in popular culture as a symbol of strength, of courage, of defiance in the face of death. And all of that is real. But the daily courage wasn't just about stepping into the arena. It was about lying down in a stone box at the end of a brutal day and knowing that the next 8 hours would be cold, that your blanket wasn't thick enough, that the straw under your back was compressed flat from months of use and barely insulated you from the floor anymore. And choosing to close your eyes anyway, because tomorrow there would be training, and the baths, and the warm porridge, and the brief hours in the heated training hall where the stones beneath your feet radiated warmth like a gift from the gods. The cold was the price of admission to another day alive. Some historians have speculated that the gladiatorial system, despite its brutality, actually provided better living conditions than many free poor Romans experienced. The insulae, the crowded apartment buildings where Rome's lower classes lived, were notorious fire traps built of wood and dried brick. They had no heating systems at all. A poor freedman in a 5th-floor insular apartment might have been colder than a gladiator with thick stone walls and a wool blanket. The freedman had drafty windows, thin walls, and the constant risk that a neighbor's brazier would set the entire building ablaze. Rome suffered devastating fires regularly, in part because of how ordinary people tried to heat their homes. The gladiator at least had stone walls that wouldn't burn, a regulated meal schedule that ensured caloric intake, access to a bathhouse that most Romans could only visit at public facilities, medical care if he was injured or fell ill. It was a terrible life, but it was a terrible life with infrastructure. And that is a distinction worth understanding, because it challenges the simple narrative of gladiators as purely tragic figures. They were trapped in a system designed to extract maximum value from their bodies. But that same system had economic incentives to keep those bodies functional. The cold was miserable, but starvation wasn't. Untreated injuries weren't complete. Neglect wasn't. The suffering was calibrated. If you are still here, thank you. If you drifted off somewhere around the hypocourse section, that is perfectly fine. These men and their cold stone cells have waited 2,000 years. They can wait until morning. Next time you are lying in bed and your feet are cold, remember, you have central heating, you have insulation, you have a mattress that isn't stuffed with straw. 2,000 years ago, the toughest athletes in the world had none of those things, and they got up the next morning and trained anyway. That is not a mystery science can solve. That is just what humans do. They endure. And sometimes that is the most fascinating thing about us.